The ceramic mug exploded against the stone tiles with a violent snap, spraying dark liquid across the pale floor like a sudden storm. Steam curled upward in thin ribbons as the coffee spread outward, creeping toward the cabinets. Elira stood frozen near the counter, her hands trembling, eyes wide as if I'd struck her instead of dropping a cup. Her face drained of color, lips parting slightly as she whispered something I barely caught over the rhythmic drip of coffee falling from the counter's edge. The silence between us felt heavy, thick with months of unspoken resentment and carefully buried truths. I didn't look up at her right away. I stayed seated, my fingers resting on the page of the book in front of me, letting the tension grow. I wanted her to feel it. When I finally raised my eyes, my face was calm, empty of emotion, deliberate in its stillness. I said I'm learning how not to care, I told her evenly. Because soon I won't have to learn anymore. She grabbed the side of the kitchen island as if the floor had tilted beneath her. Her voice shook as she said she didn't understand. The words sounded hollow, rehearsed, dishonest. This was the same woman who had spent countless evenings portraying me as stagnant, directionless, and disappointing to anyone who would listen. The same woman who had laughed with her sister and her friends about how she deserved more, how she had settled, how her life could have been bigger if she had chosen better. Now she was pretending confusion. I closed my book with care, placing it neatly on the table, my movements slow and controlled. I reminded her of things she had said, moments she thought I never heard, conversations she believed were safe because I wasn't supposed to be listening. Her face paled as each memory surfaced. Denial flickered in her eyes, then fear. She tried to step toward me, hands extended, voice soft, pleading, trying to recast betrayal as harmless venting. But I stepped back, keeping distance, my calm unwavering. I told her I wasn't blind, that I had seen the pattern, the slow erosion, the preparation. The color drained from her face completely then, and for the first time I saw panic replace confidence. I turned toward the wide window overlooking the backyard, the same yard where she had once laughed with her friends about reevaluating her life, the same place where she had spoken about feeling trapped with someone who lacked drive. I spoke without facing her, my voice steady and detached, listing what I knew, not what I suspected. I knew she had spent months tearing me down to everyone in her life. I knew she had made me into a story where she was the victim and I was the burden. I knew she was preparing for something, building a narrative that justified what she planned to do. When I turned back, tears were streaming down her face, but they weren't the tears of remorse, they were the tears of exposure. She collapsed into a chair, her body shaking, whispering that this wasn't how she wanted things to happen. I told her quietly that it rarely is. The spilled coffee continued to spread across the floor, reaching the edge of a rug neither of us moved to save. We just stood there in the aftermath of her hidden intentions, surrounded by the mess she could no longer control. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: calm. Not anger, not sadness, just stillness. A deep, quiet acceptance that something had ended long before this moment, and we were only now acknowledging the truth that had been living in the walls of our home for months. Looking back, the signs had been there long before the confrontation, layered so subtly that they blended into daily life. The first fractures were small, almost invisible. Years into our marriage, she introduced me at a corporate gathering as the guy who works with computers, stripping my work of any meaning or substance. When I corrected her later, she laughed it off, dismissing it as unimportant, as if identity itself was just semantics. But the language kept shrinking. Soon I wasn't a specialist, then not even a professional, I was just someone who did tech stuff. Each description reduced me further, turning my career into something trivial and unimpressive. Then came the physical comments, masked at first as concern, suggestions about exercise and health, later turning into public jokes that drew awkward silence from our friends. She'd touch my stomach in front of people, laugh about my habits, frame humiliation as humor. The worst part wasn't the words, it was the reactions of others. The forced laughter, the diverted eyes, the quick subject changes. They saw it too. But I stayed quiet, convincing myself it was harmless, that marriage meant tolerance, that love meant patience. The turning point came at a family dinner when conversation shifted to ambition. She praised success, drive, hunger for growth, and then looked directly at me while implying some people were content with mediocrity. The message was unmistakable. I wasn't her equal, I was her compromise. That night something shifted inside me. I began paying attention, and once you see a pattern it becomes impossible to ignore. Every gathering, every conversation, every comment fit into the same narrative. She was rising and I was the weight she carried. From that point on, I began observing instead of reacting. I watched how she spoke about other people's success and how she spoke about mine. I noticed how she praised ambition in strangers but dismissed effort in me. I heard the way she framed our marriage as a sacrifice rather than a choice. At social events, she would highlight other men's achievements while turning questions about me into vague, dismissive answers. It wasn't just disrespect, it was construction. She was building a story. One where she was the driven partner and I was the stagnant one. The moment that changed everything came when I overheard her speaking to relatives at a family celebration. She described me as someone with no ambition, no drive, no purpose, someone who simply existed rather than lived. She said she wondered what she had been thinking when she chose me. I stood there holding drinks, listening to my own wife describe me as a burden in her life. In that instant, the marriage I thought I had dissolved. I didn't confront her, I didn't react. I started documenting, not for revenge, for clarity. I needed to know if this was real or if I was losing my perspective. The evidence piled up quickly. Messages to friends, comments to family, public humiliations, private conversations, all consistent, all deliberate. But the most revealing part wasn't what she said, it was what she did. The secrecy, the locked devices, the sudden privacy, the closed screens, the guarded phone. The quiet planning that always happens before someone leaves. The discovery came on a quiet weekday morning. She left early for work, claiming an important meeting. Leaving behind a tablet on the kitchen counter, I noticed it while working from home. Normally, I would have driven it to her office without hesitation. That day, I didn't. Something stopped me. Curiosity, instinct, or maybe exhaustion from months of confusion. The device wasn't protected. Her confidence in secrecy had made her careless. What I found wasn't accidental, it was calculated. Draft messages about legal consultations, planning notes, timelines. Conversations with her sister about independence, money, and timing. Messages about bonuses, promotions, and financial security. She asked about and never noticed. She was so focused on creating a narrative that she stopped seeing reality. I saved everything, every message, every document, every plan, not out of spite but out of necessity. By the time she came home that evening and spoke about her exhausting day, I already knew the truth of her life. I listened calmly, nodded politely, and said nothing. That night, lying beside her, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity, the kind that changes how you see everything. From that moment on, I changed. Quietly, strategically. I stopped seeking approval. I stopped reacting. I stopped trying, not out of bitterness but out of self-preservation. When she criticized, I acknowledged without engagement. When she provoked, I responded with indifference. When she attempted public embarrassment, I let silence do the work. The dynamic shifted immediately. She was used to reactions, used to control through emotional pressure. Without resistance, she lost her leverage. Confusion replaced confidence. Her criticisms lost their power when they no longer produced responses. Around others, I became calm, neutral, unaffected. Her words began to expose her instead of me. The narrative started to crack. People noticed. Her attempts to diminish me made her look small, not me. The more I disengaged, the more unsettled she became. The woman who once thrived on control began to panic in the absence of it, and slowly her behavior changed. Compliments replaced insults. Interest replaced indifference. Affection replaced distance. But it wasn't love, it was fear. She wasn't trying to reconnect, she was trying to regain control. The woman who had planned her escape was now trying to undo it. Her sudden concern, her sudden affection, her sudden interest in my life came too late. It wasn't transformation, it was strategy. She started cooking again, planning dates, asking about my work, showing interest she hadn't shown in years. She rewrote history in real time, correcting her own narrative when others questioned it. She tried to reshape her image of me to fit a new version of reality. But truth doesn't bend easily. Every attempt to repair what she had broken only highlighted how calculated her behavior had been before. When she tried to be romantic, I remained distant. When she tried to be emotional, I stayed calm. When she tried to reconnect, I stayed neutral. Eventually, she broke. Tears replaced control. Confessions replaced confidence. Promises replaced planning. She spoke about therapy, change, teamwork, rebuilding. And for the first time, I told her the truth. She had spent too long convincing everyone I wasn't worth staying with, including me. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The realization hit her all at once. She hadn't just planned to leave, she had taught me how to let go. She had trained me not to care. She had created a man who no longer needed her approval. And that was the one outcome she had never anticipated. When the final conversation came, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, controlled, clean. I told her I knew everything, the planning, the timelines, the strategy, the consultations, the conversations. I showed her the evidence. Her fear was immediate, but fear doesn't undo intention. I told her I had made my own plans, quietly, efficiently, legally, strategically. While she had been preparing to leave me, I had been preparing to leave her. The difference was execution. Her plan depended on secrecy. Mine depended on action. The separation was already set in motion. The house, the legal filings, the future, all in motion. She begged, pleaded, tried to bargain with regret and emotion. But regret without accountability is just fear of consequences. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't loud. I was calm, detached, certain. I told her she had succeeded in convincing me of one thing, that I deserved better than someone who saw me as disposable. And she deserved the independence she had worked so hard to build. In the months that followed, my life stabilized in ways I hadn't imagined. Without constant criticism, without emotional erosion, without the need to prove my worth to someone committed to devaluing it, everything became lighter. Work thrived, peace replaced tension, confidence replaced doubt. I didn't feel victorious, I felt free. And that freedom didn't come from winning. It came from clarity, from self-respect, from no longer living inside someone else's narrative about my value. The man she thought was weak had simply been quiet. The man she thought was stagnant had been building. The man she underestimated had been paying attention. And when the moment came, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need approval. I only needed truth. And once I had it, everything else followed naturally. That morning in the kitchen, with coffee on the floor and silence in the air, wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the moment the truth became visible. The marriage had ended long before that cup ever hit the tile. It ended in small comments, in private jokes, in public humiliations, in quiet planning, in hidden documents, in secret timelines, in whispered conversations. It ended the moment she decided I wasn't worth respect. And in the end, we both got exactly what we built. She built a future without me, and I built a life without her. The quiet after separation has a strange texture, almost like the air itself has weight. The apartment I moved into overlooked a slow, winding river that reflected the city lights at night like broken glass stitched together by motion. In the beginning, the silence felt unnatural, too open, too empty, as if the walls themselves were waiting for voices that would never return. But slowly, that silence became comfort. There was no criticism echoing through the rooms, no tension hanging in the hallways, no passive-aggressive sighs, no emotional landmines hidden in casual conversation. Mornings were calm. I woke up without bracing myself for judgment. Evenings were peaceful. I cooked when I wanted, ate when I wanted, worked when I wanted, rested when I wanted. The constant background noise of being evaluated, measured, and found lacking was gone. I didn't realize how heavy that burden had been until it was lifted. The freedom wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and grounding. I started sleeping better, thinking clearer, breathing deeper. My work flourished not because I pushed harder, but because I was no longer distracted by emotional survival. Creativity returned. Focus returned. Confidence returned. Not the loud, performative kind, the quiet kind that comes from stability and self-trust. I stopped feeling like I had to justify my existence. My life no longer felt like a defense argument in a courtroom I never agreed to enter. It felt like ownership, autonomy, direction. The absence of constant judgment created space for growth that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. And in that space, I began to realize that peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the absence of fear. Occasionally, news about her drifted through mutual connections. Fragments of information passed casually, as if her life were just another story in circulation. She had downsized, changed neighborhoods, changed social circles, changed routines. From the outside, everything looked curated and polished: new clothes, new places, new companions, new smiles. But the patterns were familiar: the same public performance of happiness, the same carefully framed narrative, the same need to display success rather than experience it. I didn't feel anger when I heard about her. I didn't feel satisfaction either. I felt distance. Emotional distance is different from resentment. Resentment keeps you connected. Distance frees you. Her life was no longer something I measured myself against. It wasn't something I analyzed. It wasn't something I needed to understand. It was simply something that existed separately from mine. That separation felt clean, complete, final. Sometimes I wondered if she ever reflected on what happened, not in terms of blame, but in terms of behavior, whether she ever recognized the slow violence of contempt, the damage of constant devaluation, the consequences of quiet manipulation. But those thoughts never lasted long. Curiosity fades when it has no emotional anchor. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from peace. Sometimes it comes from stability. Sometimes it comes from realizing you're no longer waiting for answers you no longer need. My work life transformed in ways that surprised even me. Without the emotional drain of a relationship built on imbalance, I had energy I didn't know existed. Projects multiplied, opportunities expanded, connections grew, not because I became someone new, but because I stopped being someone diminished. People began responding to me differently, not because I changed my personality, but because I carried myself differently. Confidence attracts clarity. Stability attracts trust. Independence attracts respect. I stopped over-explaining myself, stopped shrinking my achievements to avoid making others uncomfortable, stopped minimizing my success to protect fragile egos. I learned that humility and invisibility are not the same thing, that silence and self-erasure are not virtues, that confidence does not require dominance. My consulting work expanded into partnerships, then contracts, then long-term collaborations. My calendar filled with meaningful work, not busy work. The satisfaction wasn't just financial, it was structural. My life had architecture now: purpose, flow, direction. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was building. And building feels different than surviving. Surviving is defensive, building is intentional. One is fear-driven, the other is vision-driven. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just holding my ground. There were moments late at night when memories surfaced unexpectedly. Not the betrayal, the early days, the laughter, the optimism, the belief. The version of her that existed before contempt replaced curiosity, before admiration turned into entitlement, before partnership turned into hierarchy. I didn't miss the marriage, but I missed the idea of what it was supposed to be. The version of love that existed before control entered the room, before competition replaced collaboration, before comparison replaced compassion. Those memories weren't painful, they were quiet reminders of who I used to be, not who she was. They reminded me that I had once trusted deeply, believed openly, loved fully. That mattered. It meant I hadn't been broken, only misaligned. Not everyone who leaves your life takes something from you. Some people simply return you to yourself. Loss doesn't always subtract. Sometimes it clarifies. Sometimes it simplifies. Sometimes it realigns you with who you were before you started contorting yourself to fit someone else's expectations. What surprised me most was how quickly my nervous system adapted to peace. Calm became normal, stability became baseline, silence became comfort instead of tension. My body no longer braced for conflict that never came. My mind no longer rehearsed conversations that never happened. I stopped anticipating criticism, stopped preparing defenses, stopped filtering my thoughts. Emotional safety creates mental clarity. Psychological safety creates creativity. Respect creates energy. These aren't motivational phrases, they're lived experiences. When your environment stops draining you, you start growing without trying. Growth becomes natural instead of forced. Effort becomes purposeful instead of reactive. Discipline becomes structure instead of punishment. I didn't need self-help books or affirmations. I needed space. Space from judgment. Space from manipulation. Space from constant evaluation. In that space, I found myself again. Not a new version, not an improved version, just the original version, uncompressed and undistorted. I eventually understood that what I had experienced wasn't just a failed relationship. It was a slow psychological erosion. Not through violence, not through chaos, not through obvious cruelty, but through contempt disguised as humor, superiority disguised as concern, control disguised as ambition, and manipulation disguised as honesty. Those dynamics don't explode, they corrode. They don't break bones, they break identity. They don't leave bruises, they leave doubt. And doubt is quieter than pain, but more dangerous, because it makes you question your worth instead of your situation. I had confused endurance for strength and tolerance for love. I had believed that patience was loyalty, even when it was actually self-abandonment. The experience rewired my understanding of relationships. Love without respect is not love. Partnership without equality is not partnership. Commitment without safety is not commitment. And loyalty to someone who disrespects you is not virtue, it's self-erasure. Over time, people began to know me not as someone's husband, not as someone's partner, not as someone's shadow, but as myself. That shift mattered more than I expected. Identity is not just internal, it's social. The way people see you shapes the way you see yourself. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being filtered through someone else's narrative. I wasn't being introduced as a footnote. I wasn't being minimized. I wasn't being reframed. I was just me. And that simplicity was powerful. I didn't need to perform. I didn't need to impress. I didn't need to compete. I didn't need to explain. My life became quieter but fuller, smaller in drama, larger in meaning. Less noise, more depth. Less chaos, more structure. Less performance, more presence. I never sought revenge because revenge still keeps you connected to the person who hurt you. True freedom is emotional independence. True closure is indifference. Not coldness, neutrality. The kind of neutrality that comes from resolution, not bitterness. I didn't need her to understand. I didn't need her to apologize. I didn't need her to regret. I didn't need her to validate anything. I only needed to live well, not performatively, not publicly, not loudly, but authentically. Quiet success, quiet stability, quiet peace, quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that doesn't need narrative control, the kind that simply exists. Years from now, if anyone asks about the marriage, I won't tell the long story. I won't list the details. I won't describe the planning, the betrayal, the manipulation, the strategy. I'll simply say that two people grew in different directions and one of them learned how to stop shrinking. That's the truth without the trauma. The clean version, the healed version, the version that doesn't reopen wounds. Because healing isn't about reliving, it's about integrating. It's about learning without bleeding. It's about remembering without reopening. It's about understanding without resentment. The strangest part of all of it is that I don't feel like I lost anything. I lost a structure, not a connection. I lost a contract, not a bond. I lost a role, not a relationship. What I gained was alignment with myself, with my values, with my worth, with my direction, with my future. The life I live now feels intentional instead of reactive, chosen instead of endured, built instead of tolerated. And that difference changes everything. Because a life you build belongs to you. A life you endure belongs to fear. In the end, there was no dramatic victory, no cinematic ending, no explosive confrontation that defined everything. There was just clarity, action, separation, and peace. The story didn't end with revenge, it ended with release. Not bitterness, but freedom. Not chaos, but order. Not anger, but certainty. And certainty is powerful because certainty doesn't shout, it doesn't threat, it doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it simply moves forward. And that's what I did. I moved forward, not away from her, not toward something else, but toward myself.